The war room aboard the Sovereign Reach fell silent as General Kylvor stepped through the shimmering doorway. His 4 eyes scanned the assembled officers from a dozen conquered worlds, each wearing the scars of their species' surrender. The Zenthari general's exoskeleton gleamed under the violet lighting, every ridge and plate marking centuries of military achievement. Behind him, holographic displays showed the newest target, a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Captain Marcus Chen stood in the observation deck of humanity's flagship, the Defiant Resolution, watching Earth grow smaller in the viewport. He had left behind a wife and 2 daughters, their faces frozen in his memory as he'd kissed them goodbye. The United Earth Defense Force had drafted every able person when the Zenthari ultimatum arrived: surrender or face extinction. It was a choice that echoed through every human settlement from Mars to the outer colonies. The message had been simple and brutal. Kylvor himself had broadcast it across every frequency, his translated words dripping with contempt. Humanity had 3 solar rotations to bend the knee, to accept Zenthari rule, or watch their worlds burn. The general had conquered 47 species in his career. Each one had surrendered after seeing the might of the Zenthari armada. Their weapons could crack planets. Their shields could withstand any known assault. Resistance was not just futile, it was mathematically impossible. Marcus remembered the emergency session of the World Council. Representatives from every nation had gathered in Geneva, their faces pale as they reviewed the intelligence reports. The Zenthari Empire stretched across 2 spiral arms of the galaxy. They had resources beyond counting, soldiers beyond numbering. Earth's entire military force, even with the colonial militias, numbered barely 6 million trained fighters. The Zenthari could deploy billions, but something had happened during that council session that changed everything. Ambassador Liu Feng, a woman in her 70s who had survived the resource wars and the Martian rebellion, had stood up slowly. Her voice had been soft but clear. She spoke about her grandfather who had fought in ancient wars, who had told her that superior firepower means nothing if your enemy refuses to surrender. The Romans had learned this. The Mongols had learned this. Every empire in human history had eventually learned this simple truth. The council had voted, not for surrender, not for a glorious last stand, but for something else entirely, something the Zenthari could not have anticipated because no species in their experience had ever chosen it before. They would fight, yes, but not the way the Zenthari expected. They would turn every human instinct for survival, every dirty trick learned from 10,000 years of warfare, into a weapon that could cut through technology and superior numbers. Now, Marcus stood on the bridge as Admiral Sarah Okonkwo gave the final briefing. The fleet was small by Zenthari standards. 300 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels with weapons welded to their hulls. But each one was crewed by humans who understood the stakes. The Admiral's dark eyes held no illusion of easy victory. She simply told them what needed to be done. The Zenthari advance fleet arrived in the outer system right on schedule. Kylvor watched from his command throne as his scouts reported the pitiful human resistance. A few hundred ships hiding among the asteroid belt like frightened prey. His mandibles clicked in amusement. This would be over before the day cycle ended. His warriors were eager, their particle cannons charged and ready. Victory was inevitable. What Kylvor did not know was that humanity had spent those 3 days doing more than just preparing ships. Every major city had been evacuated into underground complexes that went miles deep. Factories had been relocated to hidden facilities on moons and asteroids. Every piece of critical infrastructure had been duplicated and concealed. And most importantly, every human in uniform had been given the same instruction: survive, not win. Just survive one more day, then another, then another. The first engagement happened near Jupiter's orbit. The human ships emerged from the asteroid belt in a scattered formation that made Zenthari tactical computers flag it as incompetent. They were supposed to be in tight defensive clusters. Instead, they spread out like insects, making themselves harder to target but also unable to support each other. Kylvor ordered the attack with confidence. His ships swept forward in perfect formation, their shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall of energy. The humans fired first, their primitive kinetic weapons and early-generation plasma cannons splashing harmlessly against Zenthari defenses. For 3 minutes, it seemed like a massacre in the making. Then the human ships did something unexpected. They ran, not in a panicked retreat, but in a calculated withdrawal that split them into dozens of smaller groups. The Xanthari pursued, their superior engines easily closing the distance. But as they spread out to chase multiple targets, the humans led them into the asteroid field. What followed was not a battle, but a chaotic mess of combat that broke every rule of civilized warfare. Human ships hid behind asteroids, taking potshots before running again. They rigged mines to space debris and lured Xanthari vessels into them. They used their smaller size to navigate gaps that larger ships could not follow, and when cornered, they rammed. Not one or two desperate captains, but dozens of them, turning their ships into missiles that traded one human vessel for one Xanthari cruiser. Kael'vor watched the casualty reports with growing disbelief. He was winning, yes. His forces were destroying the human fleet. But it was taking hours instead of minutes, and his losses were mounting to unacceptable levels. 40 ships gone for what should have been a trivial victory. His tactical officers assured him this was an aberration, that once they cleared the asteroids, the humans would have nowhere to hide. They were wrong. The humans retreated to Mars, and the battle there lasted 3 weeks. They fortified the moons of Jupiter and made the Xanthari pay in blood for every kilometer. They scattered their forces across the system, refusing to give the enemy a single target to destroy. And everywhere Kael'vor sent his troops, they found humans who would not surrender, who fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. After 2 months of grinding combat, the Xanthari had technically won the Sol system, but Kael'vor stared at his losses with something he had never felt before: doubt. He had lost 3,000 ships and hundreds of thousands of soldiers to conquer one primitive system. The humans were supposed to kneel. Instead, they had made him bleed. And somewhere in the depths of space, in hidden bases he had not yet found, he knew they were still out there, still fighting, still refusing to accept the inevitable. Marcus Chen floated in the wreckage of his ship, his suit's oxygen running low, watching the Xanthari fleet pass overhead. He was one of thousands still alive in the debris fields, each one a soldier who would fight again tomorrow. He thought of his daughters and smiled. The Xanthari thought they had won. They had no idea that the war had barely started. 6 months had passed since the fall of the Sol system, and General Kael'vor found himself in a situation no Xanthari commander had faced in 3 centuries. He controlled Earth's orbit, yes. His troops occupied the ruins of major cities. His flags flew over the ashes of human civilization, but he did not control Earth, not really. Every day brought new reports of attacks, sabotage, and disappearances that defied all military logic. The underground complexes proved to be far more extensive than initial scans suggested. Entire populations had vanished into networks that stretched across continents, connected by tunnels that went so deep that Xanthari sensors could not penetrate them. When occupation forces went underground to root them out, they entered a nightmare of narrow passages where their superior weapons meant nothing. Humans fought in the dark with knives and improvised weapons, turning every tunnel into a killing ground. Commander Threxall led a battalion into the New York underground complex, confident that his enhanced troops could handle whatever primitive resistance they found. His soldiers wore powered armor that made them bulletproof and strong enough to tear through steel. They had thermal imaging, motion sensors, and enough firepower to level a building. 300 warriors descended into the tunnels beneath the ruined city. 72 hours later, only Threxall emerged. His armor was scarred and dented, one of his arms was missing, and his eyes held a haunted look that other Xanthari found disturbing. When questioned, he could only describe fragments, humans appearing from walls that seemed solid, explosions that brought down tunnels separating his forces, attacks from above and below simultaneously, the sound of human laughter echoing in the darkness before another soldier disappeared. The humans had not built the tunnels for warfare, but they had adapted them with a creativity that bordered on artistic. They flooded sections with water, electrified others, and rigged entire levels to collapse at the push of a button. They used the tunnel's cramped confines to negate every advantage the Xanthari possessed. A soldier in powered armor was impressive in open ground, but became a liability in a space too small to turn around. Kael'vor ordered the tunnels sealed and flooded, only to discover that the humans had anticipated this. They had built airlocks and water barriers that turned his attacks into expensive failures. When he tried pumping poison gas into the depths, the humans simply retreated deeper, into levels that went down miles below the surface. Some intelligence reports suggested they had dug all the way to the mantle in some locations, creating bases in places where no sensor could reach them. The situation in orbit was somehow worse. Captain Marcus Chen had survived the initial battle, rescued by an automated drone that brought him to one of the hidden bases. Now he commanded a destroyer that had been assembled in a hollowed-out asteroid built from salvaged parts and captured Xanthari technology. His crew called themselves the Ghost Fleet, and they made the space around Earth a death trap for unwary enemies. The Xanthari expected resistance to come from large coordinated fleets. Instead, they faced individual ships that struck from unexpected angles, often using tactics that seemed suicidal. A single human destroyer would accelerate toward a Xanthari battleship at full speed, fire every weapon it had, then self-destruct before the enemy could respond effectively. The battleship might survive, but it would be damaged enough to require repairs, pulling it out of active service for weeks. Marcus had learned that victory was not about winning battles. It was about making the occupation so expensive that the enemy questioned whether it was worth the cost. Every Xanthari ship that needed repairs was one less ship they could use elsewhere. Every soldier that went into the tunnels and never came out was one more family on their homeworld asking why. Their child had to die for a planet that would not surrender. The psychological warfare was perhaps most effective. Humans had always been good at storytelling, at creating myths and legends. Now they turned this skill against their occupiers. Xanthari soldiers began reporting strange occurrences. Equipment that malfunctioned in impossible ways. Entire squads that vanished without a trace. Mysterious messages left in blood on walls written in Xanthari script, but saying things no human should know about their culture. Some of it was real. Human intelligence teams had cracked Xanthari communications and were using that knowledge to sow discord. They would send false orders that led patrols into ambushes. They would edit surveillance footage to make it look like soldiers had deserted when they had actually been killed. They spread rumors of ghosts and demons, knowing that even advanced species carried superstitions from their evolutionary past. But some of the stories were genuinely unexplained. Xanthari troops began refusing certain assignments, claiming that some areas of Earth were cursed. Officers who tried to enforce discipline found their authority undermined by soldiers who trusted their survival instincts over orders. The humans were not just fighting a military campaign, they were waging war on morale, on sanity, on the very willingness to continue the occupation. Kael'vor called for reinforcements. The High Command sent 3 legions, 60,000 additional soldiers with equipment that represented a significant portion of the Empire's military budget. The general planned a massive offensive to clear the underground complexes once and for all. He would use overwhelming force, tactical nuclear weapons if necessary, to eliminate the human resistance. The offensive began with orbital bombardment of known tunnel entrances. Thousands of tons of explosives were dropped on the surface, creating craters that went down hundreds of meters. Xanthari troops poured into the breaches, supported by heavy armor and air support. For the first day, it seemed like the strategy was working. They advanced quickly, encountering less resistance than expected. Then the traps activated. The humans had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Entire sections of the tunnel network were false, designed to funnel invaders into kill zones. The apparent weakness was bait, and the Xanthari had swallowed it completely. When the counterattack came, it came from every direction at once. Underground reservoirs were breached, flooding tunnels with millions of gallons of water. Support structures were demolished, causing cave-ins that buried entire companies. The humans emerged from hidden passages behind enemy lines, attacking supply convoys and command posts. In some areas, they used chemical weapons that they had claimed not to possess, gas that ate through Xanthari environmental seals. The 3-day offensive turned into a 3-week nightmare. Kael'vor lost 15,000 soldiers, including 2 of his best commanders. The humans suffered casualties too, but they had learned to evacuate areas before the enemy arrived, to strike and fade away, to make every victory for the Xanthari so costly that it felt like a defeat. When the offensive finally ended, the Xanthari controlled no more territory than when they had started. Admiral Okonkwo watched the aftermath from a bunker command center that had been built inside an extinct volcano in South America. Her forces were battered and reduced, but they were still fighting. She reviewed the casualty reports with a heavy heart. 30,000 humans had died in the last month alone, but she also saw the Xanthari reports that her intelligence teams had intercepted. The Xanthari Empire was beginning to question the occupation. Resources that were needed elsewhere were being poured into Earth. Ships that should have been defending other borders were tied up here. And most importantly, other species in the Empire were watching. They saw that the mighty Xanthari could be fought. That occupation was not the same as victory, that a species could lose every battle and still refuse to lose the war. Marcus Chen's ship drifted through the debris field from the latest skirmish, his crew working to salvage anything useful. They found an intact Xanthari escape pod and brought it aboard. Inside was a young soldier, barely more than a juvenile by their species' standards. The soldier expected to be tortured or killed. Instead, Marcus had him treated for injuries, fed, and then released in another escape pod with a message for General Kael'vor. The message was simple. We will never kneel. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not in 1,000 years. You can kill us, but you cannot break us. Every human you face knows this. We do not fear death. We fear surrender, and we will make you pay for every inch of our world with blood and time and sanity, until you understand that some things cost more than they are worth. The young Xanthari soldier delivered the message and was promptly reassigned to a garrison post far from Earth. But the word spread through the occupation forces like a virus, whispered in barracks and repeated in reports. The humans would never kneel. And slowly, terribly, the Xanthari began to believe it. The Xanthari High Command held an emergency session in their capital world of Xentar Prime, 700 light-years from Earth. The chamber was ancient, its walls carved from a single piece of crystalline stone that had witnessed the Empire's rise from a single world to a galactic power. 12 Grand Admirals sat in a circle around the holographic display showing the Sol system, their faces expressing various degrees of concern and frustration. Grand Admiral Vexnor, eldest of the Council, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of 2 centuries of military service. He had conquered 20 systems personally, overseen the integration of dozens of species into the Empire. But his analysis of the Earth situation was blunt and disturbing. The occupation was costing them more resources per month than the entire annual budget of some sectors. If the humans could hold out for another year, it would represent a net loss to the Empire. The problem was not just military. Other species within the Empire were watching Earth's resistance with increasing interest. The Kalathi, who had surrendered after a single demonstration of Xanthari power, were now asking uncomfortable questions about their own subjugation. There had been minor riots on 3 Kalathi worlds, quickly suppressed but worrying nonetheless. The humans were proving that resistance was possible, and that was a contagion the Empire could not afford to spread. Back on Earth, General Kael'vor faced a different kind of problem. His soldiers were breaking. Not in obvious ways that military discipline could address, but in subtle psychological deterioration that was harder to combat. They obeyed orders, they performed their duties, but the edge was gone. They moved through the ruins of human cities like they expected ambush from every shadow, because they did. The constant stress of occupation was grinding down soldiers who had been trained for conquest, not extended guerrilla warfare. The medical officers reported increasing rates of what humans called PTSD among the troops. Xanthari warriors who had fought in dozens of campaigns were now unable to sleep without medication. Some refused to enter buildings. Others panicked at sudden noises. The humans had turned Earth itself into a weapon, a place where every moment carried the threat of violence, where safety was an illusion, and death could come from anywhere at any time. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Marcus's daughter, led a resistance cell in what used to be Chicago. She was 23 years old and had killed 17 Xanthari soldiers in personal combat. Her team specialized in psychological operations, the kind of harassment that did not show up on casualty reports, but eroded enemy morale more effectively than any weapon. They had learned that the Xanthari had excellent night vision, but relied heavily on their other senses. Her latest operation involved a compound that the Xanthari had set up in an old skyscraper. 50 soldiers, well fortified, with sensors that should have detected any approach. Sarah's team spent 2 weeks preparing. They studied the guards' routines, mapped their sensor coverage, and found the weakness. The Xanthari recycled their air through a central system, a perfectly logical design that became a fatal vulnerability. They introduced a chemical compound into the air system, something that humans had engineered specifically to affect Xanthari neurology. It was not lethal, not immediately, but it caused hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme anxiety. Within 6 hours, the soldiers in that compound were seeing threats that were not there, firing at shadows, reporting enemies that did not exist. By the time relief forces arrived, 3 soldiers had killed each other in friendly fire incidents, and the rest were mentally unfit for service. The Zenthari Medical Corps had no treatment for the compound because they had never encountered it before. The affected soldiers had to be shipped back to Zentar Prime for long-term psychiatric care. And Sarah's team did this to 3 more compounds in the following month, each time refining their technique, each time breaking more of the enemy without firing a shot. Across the planet, similar operations were being conducted by thousands of resistance cells, some focused on destroying infrastructure, others on gathering intelligence, but increasingly the focus was on making the occupation unbearable rather than impossible. The humans had accepted that they could not win through conventional means, so they invented unconventional ones, drawing on centuries of guerrilla warfare tactics and adding new innovations born of desperation. In the asteroid belt, Marcus Chen was planning something that would have been considered insane if humans still cared about such distinctions. His ghost fleet had captured a Zenthari supply vessel, a massive ship carrying equipment and provisions for the occupation forces. Instead of destroying it, they were going to steal it. Not just the cargo, but the entire vessel, and use it to infiltrate Zenthari supply lines. The operation required precision that bordered on the impossible. They had to disable the ship's distress beacon without alerting other vessels. They had to eliminate the crew without damaging critical systems, and they had to do it all while avoiding the dozens of Zenthari warships patrolling the area. Marcus assembled a team of 30 volunteers, knowing that the survival rate would be low. They used a captured Zenthari shuttle to approach the supply vessel, broadcasting stolen identification codes. The shuttle docked successfully, and the assault team moved through the ship with practiced efficiency. They had studied Zenthari ship layouts for months, knew every corridor and access point. The crew, not expecting trouble this deep in controlled space, were caught completely off guard. In 17 minutes, the ship was theirs. Marcus's crew piloted it deeper into the asteroid belt, where human technicians were waiting to modify its systems. They stripped out the tracking devices, reprogrammed the navigation computer, and altered the hull markings. When they were done, the supply vessel was indistinguishable from any other Zenthari logistics ship. For the next 3 months, the captured vessel operated behind enemy lines, delivering real supplies to Zenthari forces, while also gathering intelligence and occasionally delivering surprises. In one case, they included human-made explosives hidden in ammunition crates that detonated when the ammunition was loaded into weapons. In another, they delivered medical supplies that had been contaminated with slow-acting pathogens that caused debilitating but non-lethal illness. The Zenthari realized too late that one of their own ships had been compromised. By the time they identified which vessel it was, the Ghost Fleet had abandoned it, leaving it to drift into a Zenthari patrol, where it was destroyed as a suspected trap. But the damage was done. The Zenthari could no longer trust their own supply chain. Every shipment had to be inspected, every container checked, adding weeks to logistics and tying up resources in security measures. General Kylvor received orders from the High Command that he had dreaded. He was to begin extraction of maximum value from occupied territory to offset operational costs. In plain language, they wanted him to start stripping Earth of resources to pay for the occupation. He was to establish mining operations, seize food production facilities, and extract anything of value. The Empire was no longer trying to integrate Earth. They were trying to make the conquest profitable enough to justify its continuation. The order was a mistake, and Kylvor knew it, but he had no choice but to obey. When the Zenthari began strip mining operations in Africa, the local resistance cells responded with a fury that shocked even seasoned observers. They attacked the mining sites with such ferocity that the Zenthari had to assign entire battalions just to guard the operations. And even then, accidents happened. Equipment malfunctioned mysteriously. Drones crashed. Workers disappeared. In South America, when the Zenthari tried to seize agricultural facilities, the humans burned their own crops rather than let them be taken. The Zenthari could not understand this logic. These were resources the humans needed to survive, yet they destroyed them to deny the enemy. It was a level of spite and determination that did not fit into any Zenthari tactical model. Admiral Okonkwo watched the reports with grim satisfaction. The Zenthari were doing exactly what she hoped they would. By trying to extract resources, they were committing more forces to vulnerable positions. Every mining operation was a target. Every supply convoy was an opportunity for ambush. The occupation was becoming more expensive, not less, and the High Command was beginning to question whether Earth was worth the cost. In the underground command centers, human strategists were planning the next phase. They had survived the initial invasion. They had made the occupation costly. Now they needed to make it unbearable, not just for the soldiers on the ground, but for the civilians back on Zentar Prime who were starting to ask why their sons and daughters were dying for a planet that produced nothing but casualties. The war was far from over. But it had shifted from a question of survival to a question of endurance. Could the humans outlast the Zenthari will to occupy? Could they make their world so toxic, so expensive, so psychologically damaging that the Empire would choose to leave rather than stay? It was a gamble that would cost millions more lives. But it was a gamble that, for the first time, humans believed they could win. Kael'vor stood in his command center, looking at the holographic display of Earth. The planet was marked with red zones where resistance was. The breaking point came not from a grand battle or strategic victory, but from a simple video that spread through the Zenthari military network like a disease. Someone had leaked footage from a helmet camera worn by a soldier during a tunnel raid. The video was 18 minutes long, and those who watched it were never quite the same afterward. It started normally enough. A squad of 12 Zenthari warriors entering a tunnel complex beneath what used to be Tokyo. They moved in formation, weapons ready, sensors active. The tunnel was narrow but manageable, lit by their helmet lights. For the first 3 minutes, nothing happened. Just the sound of their breathing and the echo of their footsteps. Then the lights went out. Not their helmet lights, but something about the tunnel seemed to absorb the light, making the beams diffuse and weak. The squad leader ordered tighter formation. That was when the sound started. Human voices singing something in their native language. The translation software identified it as an old war song, something about marching through adversity. But the voices came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the tunnels in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. One soldier broke formation, spinning to face a threat that was not there. The squad leader ordered discipline, but his voice carried an edge of nervousness. They continued forward, and the singing grew louder. Then it stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. In that silence, something moved in the darkness beyond their lights. The next 12 minutes were chaos captured in fragmentary images. Humans emerging from walls that seemed solid, attacking with blades that cut through armor, then vanishing again. Explosions that separated the squad. The sound of Zenthari soldiers calling for help, their voices growing distant. The camera's owner ran through passages that twisted and doubled back, pursued by something he never clearly saw, but could hear breathing behind him. The video ended with the soldier stumbling into a large chamber where his remaining squad mates had gathered. 5 survivors out of 12, but the chamber was not empty. Arranged in a circle around them were human figures, dozens of them, standing perfectly still in the darkness. The helmet lights showed their faces, all ages, some elderly, some barely adults. None of them were armed with guns. They just stood there, watching, waiting. The Zenthari opened fire, and that was when the chamber's true purpose became clear. The humans had not been standing in a circle by chance. They had been positioned around support pillars that were already rigged to collapse. When the firing started, one human pressed a detonator. The video showed a brief moment of the ceiling beginning to fall, then nothing but static. No one from that squad survived. The video had been recovered from the soldier's helmet found in the wreckage weeks later. When it leaked to the general military network, the Zenthari High Command tried to suppress it, but they were too late. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already seen it, and many had sent copies to family and friends back home. The video became known as the Tokyo Testament, and it fundamentally changed how Zenthari society viewed the war. On Zentar Prime, protests began for the first time in living memory. Families of soldiers demanded to know why their children were being sent to die in underground warrens, fighting an enemy that seemed more like demons than a primitive species. The government's response was to tighten information controls, but that only made things worse. Now the Empire was not just fighting humans on Earth. They were fighting doubt and fear among their own population. General Kael'vor called a meeting with his remaining senior officers. Out of the 20 commanders he had started with, only 11 remained. 3 had been killed in action, 4 had been relieved of duty due to mental breakdown, and 2 had requested transfer to any other posting, even accepting demotions to get away from Earth. The meeting was supposed to discuss new tactics, but it became something else entirely. Commander Threxall, the sole survivor of the first tunnel raid months ago, spoke with a voice that carried no hope. He stated plainly that the war was unwinnable, not because the humans had better weapons or tactics, but because they had something the Zenthari could not combat: absolute refusal to accept defeat. Every metric that military science used to predict when an enemy would surrender had been exceeded. The humans should have given up months ago. Instead, they were fighting harder. Another commander, fresh from Zentar Prime and full of tactical academy theories, argued that they simply needed more troops, better equipment, revised strategies. Threxall laughed, a sound that was disturbing coming from a Zenthari. He pointed out that they had tried everything: overwhelming force, surgical strikes, psychological warfare, resource denial. The humans adapted to everything. They learned from every defeat and came back with new tactics that exploited weaknesses the Zenthari did not know they had. Kael'vor listened to the discussion with increasing despair. He was a general who had never lost a campaign, and now he was being asked to admit that victory might be impossible. The mathematics were clear. At current casualty rates, the occupation could continue for perhaps another year before the Empire's military capacity was stretched too thin to maintain other borders. And in that year, how many more soldiers would die? How many more videos like the Tokyo Testament would leak to destroy morale? On Earth, humans were facing their own crisis. The resistance had lasted longer than anyone thought possible, but the cost was staggering. Entire cities were ruins. Millions had died from direct combat, starvation, and disease. The underground complexes were cramped and unhealthy, with children growing up never having seen the sun. Admiral Okonkwo reviewed the reports from resistance cells and saw the strain. They were winning, in a sense, but winning meant surviving another day in hell. Marcus Chen brought his daughter Sarah to one of the rare meetings where field commanders could gather safely. She looked thinner than he remembered, her eyes carrying the weight of too many deaths witnessed and caused. They embraced briefly, 2 soldiers who happened to be family, then settled into the business of war. The meeting's purpose was to discuss what came after. Assuming the Zenthari left, what would humanity do then? It was a question no one had dared ask before. The assumption had always been that they would not survive long enough to face it. But intelligence reports suggested the Zenthari were wavering. Their supply shipments were decreasing. New reinforcements were not arriving. There were rumors of other species in the Empire causing problems, emboldened by Earth's example. It was possible, barely possible, that the occupation might end not with human victory, but with Zenthari withdrawal. The strategists war-gamed various scenarios. If the Zenthari left suddenly, humanity would face years of rebuilding. The infrastructure was shattered, the population reduced, the ecosystem damaged by orbital bombardment and chemical warfare. But they would be free, and that word carried weight that made the sacrifices feel bearable. However, there was another possibility that worried the commanders more. What if the Zenthari decided that if they could not have Earth, no one could? Their fleet had the capacity to sterilize the planet from orbit, to render it completely uninhabitable. It would be an expensive gesture of spite, but it would ensure that humanity's resistance did not inspire others. The question became whether the Zenthari would choose that option if they decided to leave. Grand Admiral Vexner on Zentar Prime was facing the same question from the opposite side. The High Command had privately decided that the Earth occupation was unsustainable. But they could not simply withdraw without losing face. Every species in the Empire would see it as weakness. The Kalathi rebellion was already spreading to 3 more worlds. If Earth was seen to win through resistance, it could trigger a wave of uprisings that would tear the Empire apart. The solution Vexner proposed was coldly logical. They would withdraw forces gradually, claiming the humans had been reduced to insignificance and were not worth the attention. They would establish a blockade to ensure humanity could not expand beyond their system, and they would leave behind monitoring stations to watch for any sign of recovery. It was not victory, but it was not defeat either. It was a draw dressed up as a tactical redeployment, but Vexnor had another proposal, one that most of the High Command found distasteful. Before withdrawing, they should offer the humans a deal, a negotiated end to hostilities where both sides gained something. The humans would get their world back, and the Zenthari would get to claim they had accomplished their goal of teaching a lesson about resistance. It was a face-saving measure that acknowledged reality without admitting defeat. The problem was finding a human leader to negotiate with. The Zenthari had been fighting a decentralized resistance with no single command structure. Admiral Okonkwo was the closest thing to a unified military leader, but she was deep underground and surrounded by soldiers who would die before letting her be captured. Kyle Vor would need to extend an olive branch, to offer negotiations from a position of something other than obvious desperation. He chose to send a message through one of the captured human soldiers they had been holding. The prisoner was treated well, given medical care, fed properly. Then he was brought before Kael'vor personally. The general. The meeting place was neutral by necessity, chosen with paranoid care by both sides. An abandoned space station orbiting Neptune, too far from Earth for quick Zenthari reinforcement, too far from the main Zenthari fleet for effective human sabotage. Admiral Sarah Okonkwo arrived with a guard of 20 soldiers, knowing they would be useless if this was a trap, but unwilling to appear weak. General Kael'vor came with an equal number, his expression unreadable behind his species' natural armor plating. They met in a chamber that had once been a human research facility, back when humanity had been exploring their own system in peace. Now it was a cold, depressurized room where two enemies would try to find words that could end a war neither side was truly winning. Both leaders wore environmental suits, standing on opposite sides of a conference table that had survived decades of abandonment. Kael'vor spoke first, his words translated by a computer system that both sides had agreed upon. He acknowledged that the Zenthari had underestimated humanity. It was the closest thing to an apology that his culture allowed. He stated that the Empire had achieved its goal of demonstrating its power, but continuing the occupation served no strategic purpose. He proposed a withdrawal of all Zenthari forces from the Sol system in exchange for human agreement not to expand militarily beyond their star system for 50 years. Okonkwo listened without interruption, her dark eyes studying the alien general with intensity that made even his guards nervous. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her words were chosen with the precision of someone who knew they would be analyzed by both governments for hidden meanings. She began by rejecting the proposal entirely. The Zenthari had invaded without provocation, had killed millions, had reduced Earth to a battlefield. They did not get to claim victory and walk away with honor intact. If Kael'vor wanted peace, the terms would be dictated by the species that had refused to surrender, despite every reason to do so. The Zenthari would withdraw immediately and completely. They would provide reparations in the form of technology and resources. And they would formally apologize for the invasion in a document that would be distributed throughout their empire. It was Kael'vor's turn to be silent. What Okonkwo demanded was impossible. The High Command would never accept such terms. It would be seen as humiliating defeat, would undermine the entire basis of the Empire's authority. Other species would see humans dictating terms to the mighty Zenthari and realize that resistance was not just possible, but could be successful. The Empire would collapse into rebellion within a decade, but as he prepared to refuse to walk away from the negotiation, something stopped him. He looked at Okonkwo and saw something that he had learned to recognize over months of fighting humans. She was not bluffing. She would rather die, would rather let every human die than accept a peace that did not acknowledge their victory. It was the same insanity that had made the occupation impossible, the same refusal to accept reality that had cost him thousands of soldiers. Kael'vor made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He asked Okonkwo what she truly wanted, not as a military leader, but as someone responsible for billions of lives. What outcome would let her sleep at night knowing she had done right by her people? It was a personal question, not a military one, and it changed the tone of the conversation. Okonkwo's answer was surprising. She wanted the Zenthari to leave, yes. She wanted recognition of human sovereignty, absolutely. But more than that, she wanted to ensure this never happened again, not just to Earth, but to any species. She wanted the Zenthari to understand that conquest was no longer an acceptable path, that the galaxy was large enough for different species to exist without one dominating others. The general pointed out that this was naive idealism. The galaxy was not a peaceful place. Species competed for resources, for territory, for survival. The strong dominated the weak because that was the nature of existence. Humanity had proven stronger than expected, yes, but that made them an exception, not evidence that the entire system should change. Okonkwo smiled, and it was not a happy expression. She told Kael'vor that he was wrong about humans being an exception. In the months since the invasion, human intelligence had made contact with 17 other species within the Zenthari Empire. All of them were watching Earth's resistance with growing interest. 5 had already begun their own quiet rebellions. The Kalathi uprising was just the beginning. Humanity had proven that the Empire could be fought, and that proof was worth more than any military victory. She showed him intercepted communications, reports that her intelligence teams had gathered. The evidence was undeniable. The Empire was fracturing, not because of human military success, but because humans had changed the narrative. For centuries, Zenthari dominance had seemed inevitable, natural, unchangeable. Now it seemed vulnerable. And once people believed change was possible, it became inevitable. Kael'vor reviewed the intelligence with growing horror. If what Okonkwo showed him was accurate, the Empire had perhaps 5 years before widespread rebellion made it ungovernable. The occupation of Earth was not just expensive. It was actively destabilizing the entire galactic order that the Zenthari had spent centuries building. Withdrawing from Earth would be seen as weakness, but staying was guaranteeing eventual collapse. He asked what humanity wanted in exchange for helping to stabilize the situation. Okonkwo's answer was complex, but essentially amounted to a new order. The Zenthari would remain powerful, yes, but as peacekeepers rather than conquerors. They would use their military to protect smaller species from existential threats, not to expand their territory. In exchange, humanity would share what they had learned about resisting occupation, would teach other species how to make conquest too expensive to attempt. It was a radical proposal that would require the Zenthari to fundamentally reimagine their place in the galaxy. Instead of an empire, they would become something like the protector of a federation. They would still have power, still have influence, but it would be based on consent rather than force. The general pointed out that such a change would take decades and face massive resistance from conservative factions within Zenthari society. Okonkwo acknowledged this, but argued that the alternative was worse. The Empire could try to maintain control through force, but every occupied world would become another Earth, draining resources and lives until there was nothing left. Or they could adapt, could evolve into something that provided security without requiring subjugation. It would not be easy, and it would not be quick, but it was the only path that did not end in empire-wide collapse. The negotiation continued for 3 days. Both leaders called in advisors, consulted with their respective governments, argued over details that seemed minor but carried enormous implications. The turning point came when Kael'vor received a message from Grand Admiral Vexnor. The High Command had reviewed the intelligence about spreading rebellions and come to the same conclusion Okonkwo had presented. The Empire's current trajectory was unsustainable. Vexnor gave Kael'vor authority to negotiate whatever terms he could that would allow for face-saving withdrawal from Earth while beginning the process of transitioning to a new galactic order. It was a stunning reversal from an empire that had seemed unshakable months ago. But the evidence was undeniable. The cost of conquest had become greater than the value of empire. The agreement they finally reached was complex and would take years to fully implement. The Zenthari would withdraw from Earth immediately, acknowledging it as a sovereign system that had successfully defended itself. They would provide limited technology transfer to assist in rebuilding. In exchange, Earth would not seek expansion beyond their system for 20 years and would participate in a new galactic assembly where species could resolve disputes without warfare. Most controversially, humanity agreed to send advisors to species considering rebellion, not to help them fight, but to help them negotiate. The humans had learned that victory through resistance was possible but horrifically expensive. Better to achieve independence through negotiation, backed by the threat of becoming another Earth for any would-be conqueror. When the agreement was announced, reactions on both sides were mixed. Many humans felt they deserved more, that the Zenthari should pay for every death, every destroyed city, every life ruined by the occupation. Many Zenthari felt humiliated, believing they had surrendered to a primitive species after achieving all military objectives. But the leadership on both sides understood that peace, however imperfect, was better than the alternative. Marcus Chen stood on the surface of Mars, having emerged from the underground bases for the first time in a year. The Zenthari fleet was withdrawing, their massive ships disappearing one by one through jump points that would take them back to their core territories. His daughter Sarah stood beside him, and for the first time since the war began, they watched the stars without waiting for an attack. They talked quietly about what came next. Earth needed to be rebuilt, but it would take generations. The environment was damaged, the infrastructure destroyed, the population traumatized. But they were free, and that made everything else seem manageable. Sarah mentioned that 5 years after the Zenthari withdrawal, Earth remained a world of contradictions. The underground cities that had sheltered billions during the occupation were being transformed into permanent habitats. Their cramped tunnels expanded into comfortable living spaces with artificial sunlight and hydroponics gardens. The surface cities were rebuilding slowly. New structures rising from the ruins with designs that incorporated both human aesthetics and lessons learned from Zenthari. Architecture Admiral Sarah Okonkwo had retired from military service but found herself busier than ever as the first human ambassador to the new Galactic Assembly. The Assembly met on a neutral space station built jointly by 5 different species, each contributing their unique engineering expertise. It was an impressive structure, a physical manifestation of the new order that was slowly, painfully, taking shape across the galaxy. The Assembly's first major crisis involved the Kalathi, whose rebellion had inspired so many others. Their homeworld had successfully expelled Zenthari occupation forces, but now faced economic collapse. The infrastructure that had supported their civilization was largely Zenthari-built, and without the Empire's resources, they were struggling to maintain basic services. Some Kalathi leaders were quietly suggesting they invite the Zenthari back under better terms. Okonkwo arrived on the Kalathi homeworld with a team of human engineers and economists. What she found was worse than the report suggested. The Kalathi had approximately 6 months before widespread famine began. Their industrial base was dependent on materials that had been shipped from other Zenthari-controlled worlds. Without those shipments, factories were closing. Unemployment was skyrocketing, and social unrest was building. The solution required bringing together the Kalathi, the Zenthari, and 3 other species that had materials the Kalathi needed. Okonkwo spent weeks negotiating trade agreements, technology transfers, and economic aid packages. The Zenthari were reluctant to help the species that had rebelled against them, but Kael'vor, now Grand Admiral overseeing the transition, understood that failure here would doom the entire project of peaceful coexistence. The agreement they reached became a template for future cooperation. The Kalathi would receive the resources they needed at fair market prices, paid for through long-term trade agreements that benefited all parties. The Zenthari would provide technical expertise in exchange for raw materials they could no longer simply take, and humanity would offer administrative support and training, sharing the hard-won knowledge of how to rebuild a civilization from near destruction. Meanwhile, on Earth, Marcus Chen had taken on the task of training the next generation of humanity's defenders. The war had proven that humans needed to maintain military capability, but the focus had shifted. Instead of preparing for invasion, they were preparing for participation in a wider galactic community. That meant understanding alien psychology, mastering new technologies, and learning to fight not just physically, but diplomatically. His daughter Sarah returned to Earth periodically between advisory missions. She had spent time with 7 different species, teaching them what humanity had learned about resistance. But she noticed a troubling pattern. Many species saw Earth's example as proof that violence was the answer to oppression. They missed the critical point that humanity's victory had come at tremendous cost, and that negotiation, backed by the threat of making occupation unbearable, was better than actual prolonged conflict. During one of her visits, Sarah spoke at the rebuilt United Nations building in Geneva. Her speech was broadcast across human space and distributed throughout the assembly. She talked about the price of Earth's freedom. The millions dead, the cities destroyed, the psychological trauma that would affect generations. She emphasized that humanity had not wanted to fight, had tried negotiation first, and had only resorted to resistance when every other option was exhausted. Her message was aimed at both sides of every potential conflict. To oppressed species, she said that freedom was worth fighting for, but that the goal should be to make the oppressor choose to leave, not to destroy them. To potential conquerors, she said that conquest was no longer a viable strategy in a galaxy where even the weakest species could make occupation a living nightmare. The only sustainable path forward was cooperation. The speech was translated into 47 languages and became required viewing at military academies across the galaxy, including Zenthari ones. Some found it naive. Others found it radical. But most found it compelling because it came from someone who had lived through the alternative and knew exactly what she was talking about. Grand Admiral Kael'vor was implementing reforms within the Zenthari military that would have been unthinkable before. Earth. The Empire's forces were being reorganized from conquest legions into defense fleets. Soldiers were being retrained with emphasis on peacekeeping rather than subjugation. It was a massive undertaking that faced resistance at every level from commanders who believed the old ways were better. The resistance within Zenthari society went beyond just the military. Large segments of the population had grown up believing in the Empire's manifest destiny to rule the galaxy. Now they were being told that this destiny was a lie, that conquest was wrong, that other species deserved self-determination. For many, it felt like their entire worldview was being destroyed without adequate replacement. Kael'vor gave speeches and wrote articles trying to explain the necessity of change. He pointed out that the Empire had been slowly bleeding resources for decades, that conquest had long since stopped being profitable, that maintaining control over unwilling populations cost more than it generated. The occupation of Earth had simply made undeniable what many had privately known for years. The old model was unsustainable. But changing minds required more than logic. It required showing Zenthari citizens that there were benefits to the new order. The trade agreements that replaced tribute payments were actually more profitable for Zenthari businesses. The reduction in military spending allowed for investment in infrastructure and education. And most importantly, young Zenthari were no longer dying in occupation duties that served no real purpose. The Galactic Assembly faced its most serious crisis when the Draviks, a species that had been considering joining, suddenly invaded a neighboring system without provocation. It was a test of whether the new order could actually maintain peace or whether it was just empty words backed by nothing. The Assembly had to respond, but how? They had no unified military force, no mechanism for collective action against aggression. Okonkwo proposed a solution that was controversial, but ultimately accepted. A coalition force would be assembled from volunteers from multiple species, including humans and Zenthari fighting side by side for the first time. Their mission was not conquest or punishment, but restoration of the original borders and establishment of a peacekeeping presence until a negotiated settlement could be reached. Marcus. Chen volunteered to lead the human contingent, a decision that terrified his family but seemed inevitable to those who knew him. He commanded a fleet that was tiny compared to what he had led during the war, but it was better equipped and supported by allies who shared a common goal. The coalition force included Zenthari ships under Kael'vor's personal command, a symbolic gesture that carried enormous political weight. The campaign against the Draviks was brief but intense. The invaders had not expected united opposition and were unprepared for the combined tactical capabilities of multiple species. Human guerrilla expertise, Zenthari firepower, and Kalathi electronic warfare capabilities created a devastating combination. Within 3 weeks, the Draviks withdrew from occupied territory and requested negotiations. The peace terms were significant. The Draviks would join the assembly under probationary status, would pay reparations to the invaded species, and would accept monitoring teams to ensure compliance. But they would not be destroyed or occupied. The goal was to bring them into the new order, not to punish them into submission. It was a different kind of victory, one that prioritized long-term stability over immediate satisfaction. The success of the coalition operation did more to legitimize the Galactic Assembly than years of negotiations could have achieved. It proved that the new order had teeth, that aggression would be met with coordinated response, and that the choice was between cooperation and isolation. More species began applying for membership, seeing the benefits of collective security and economic cooperation. On Earth, the rebuilding continued with increasing assistance from other species. Zenthari engineers helped restore power grids using fusion technology that humans had not yet mastered. Kalathi agricultural experts introduced crops that could grow in Earth's damaged soil. Other species contributed in smaller but meaningful ways, creating a sense that humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy. Sarah Chen visited the memorial that had been built in Chicago, where she had fought some of her earliest resistance battles. The memorial listed the names of every human who had died during the occupation, millions of names carved into black stone that stretched for kilometers. She found her mother's name among them, killed in an orbital bombardment during the first week of the war. Beside her mother's name, 20 years had passed since the Zenthari withdrawal, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that even the most optimistic architects of the New Order had not anticipated. The Galactic Assembly now included 83 member species, with another 15 holding observer status. The old Xanthari Empire existed only in history texts, replaced by a loose confederation where power came from cooperation rather than domination. Marcus Chen was old now, his hair white and his movements slower than they had been during the war, but his mind remained sharp, and his reputation as one of humanity's greatest military leaders meant he was still consulted on matters of galactic security. He sat in his home on Mars watching his grandchildren play in a garden that would have been impossible during the occupation. The air was thin but breathable, the result of 20 years of terraforming efforts that multiple species had contributed to. His daughter Sarah had become the Assembly's lead negotiator for conflict resolution. She traveled constantly, mediating disputes before they could escalate into violence. Her success rate was impressive, largely because both sides in any conflict knew that she understood the true cost of war. When Sarah Chen told you that negotiation was better than fighting, you believed her because she had earned that authority through personal experience. She was currently on the Dravik's homeworld, working to integrate them fully into the Assembly after their probationary period ended. The Draviks had proven to be difficult partners, their culture valuing strength and conquest in ways that clashed with the Assembly's principles. But Sarah had learned that cultural change took time, and that forcing rapid transformation often backfired. Patience and consistent pressure were more effective than ultimatums. The Dravik's prime minister, a massive individual named Throck, met with her in a chamber designed to intimidate visitors. Sarah was not intimidated. She had faced down creatures far more frightening in the tunnels beneath Earth. She told Throck bluntly that the Draviks had a choice to make. They could continue viewing the Assembly as a constraint on their natural superiority, or they could see it as an opportunity to achieve greatness through cooperation rather than conquest. Throck argued that this was asking his people to deny their nature. The Draviks had evolved as apex predators on a harsh world. Strength and dominance were not cultural choices but biological imperatives. How could they be expected to simply ignore millions of years of evolution? Sarah's response was simple. Humans had faced the same question. Humanity's evolutionary history was full of violence, tribalism, and competition. But they had learned to channel those instincts into less destructive outlets. She showed him recordings of human sports, competitive industries, exploratory missions to dangerous systems. All of these allowed humans to satisfy their need for challenge and achievement without requiring them to dominate others. The Draviks could do the same. Their strength could be used for protecting weaker species rather than conquering them. Their competitive nature could drive innovation rather than warfare. Evolution provided tendencies, not destinies. Throck was skeptical, but agreed to present the ideas to his government. Sarah knew it would take years, maybe decades, for the Draviks to fully embrace the Assembly's principles. But she also knew that every year of peace made future war less likely. Habits formed over time, and the habit of resolving disputes through negotiation rather than violence was spreading across the galaxy. Back on Earth, Admiral Okonkwo was overseeing the graduation ceremony for the latest class of the Galactic Defense Academy. The academy had been established 15 years ago, initially controversial because it trained military officers from multiple species to work together. Critics on both sides had worried it would either be dominated by one species or would fail due to cultural differences making cooperation impossible. Instead, the academy had become one of the most successful institutions in the new galactic order. Students learned not just military tactics, but diplomacy, xenopsychology, and conflict resolution. The goal was to create officers who could fight when necessary, but preferred not to. Every graduate understood that their job was to make themselves obsolete, to create a galaxy so stable that large-scale military forces were unnecessary. The graduating class included humans, Xanthari, Kalathi, and representatives from a dozen other species. They stood in formation, their different physiologies and cultural backgrounds creating a visual representation of the new galaxy. Okonkwo gave the commencement speech, talking about the price of the peace they now enjoyed and the responsibility they had to maintain it. She told them about the occupation, about the millions who had died, about the cities that had burned and the tunnels that had become graveyards. She did not spare them the details because she needed them to understand what they were preventing. War was not glorious adventure but horror that should be avoided at almost any cost. Almost, but not quite. because there were still things worth fighting for, if all other options failed. The speech was broadcast across the assembly, as all Academy graduation speeches were. Parents on dozens of worlds watched their children receive commissions, proud but apprehensive. The galaxy was more peaceful than it had been in centuries, but threats remained. Pirates, rogue states, and the occasional species that had not yet learned the lessons of the Xanthari-human war. The graduates would face these challenges, hopefully with wisdom rather than just weapons. Grand Admiral Kael'vor, now ancient by Xanthari standards, watched the broadcast from his home on Zentar Prime. He rarely appeared in public anymore, but he maintained correspondence with several of the key figures who had shaped the new order. His latest letter to Marcus Chen discussed the question that occupied both their minds. Would the peace last? Kael'vor's analysis was sobering. The current generation remembered the war, understood the costs, and chose cooperation because they had experienced the alternative. But what would happen when new generations arose who had never known large-scale conflict? Would they dismiss the lessons of the war as outdated? Would they return to the old patterns of conquest and domination? The cycle of history suggested that peace was always temporary, that eventually someone would decide that force was the answer. Marcus's response was more optimistic, though not naively so. He argued that the institutions they had built were stronger than any previous attempts at galactic governance. The assembly was not just a meeting place, but an interconnected web of economic and cultural ties that made conflict increasingly expensive. Every species now had trading partners, cultural exchange programs, and shared scientific endeavors that would be disrupted by war. More importantly, the new generation was growing up with friends and colleagues from other species. Human children played with Xanthari children in integrated schools. Kalathi artists collaborated with Dravix engineers. These personal connections created empathy that transcended species boundaries. It was harder to support war against someone you had gone to school with. Harder to dehumanize an enemy that you had worked beside on scientific research. But both old warriors acknowledged that eternal vigilance was necessary. Peace was not a destination, but a process that required constant maintenance. Conflicts would arise, misunderstandings would happen, and resources would be scarce. The question was whether the galaxy could resolve these issues without resorting to large-scale violence. Sarah Chen's work took her to a newly discovered species on the galactic fringe. The Yalori had just achieved faster-than-light travel and were broadcasting signals requesting contact. First contact protocols, developed over the past 2 decades, emphasized patience and mutual respect. Sarah was part of a carefully selected team representing multiple species, chosen to demonstrate the diversity and cooperation of the assembly. The Yalori were an aquatic species, their civilization built in vast underwater cities. They were initially overwhelmed by the discovery that they were not alone in the universe, and that dozens of other intelligent species existed. The first contact team spent months helping them adjust to the new reality, answering questions, and explaining how the galactic community functioned. What struck Sarah most was the Yalori's reaction to learning about the Xanthari-human war. They were horrified by the casualties and destruction, but also fascinated by humanity's resistance. They asked detailed questions about how a smaller force had managed to defeat a galactic empire. Sarah found herself explaining yet again that humanity had not defeated the Xanthari in any traditional sense. They had simply made occupation too expensive to maintain. The Yalori leader, a philosopher named Shelmora, understood immediately. Her species had their own history of tribal conflicts that had nearly destroyed their civilization before they learned cooperation. She pointed out that the lesson of the war was not that violence worked, but that stubbornness could outlast force. The Xanthari had military superiority, but humans had the advantage of defending their home. That asymmetry made all the difference. Shelmora asked what humanity would have done if the Xanthari had chosen to completely destroy Earth rather than occupy it. It was a question Sarah had thought about many times. The honest answer was that humanity would have died. They had no ability to prevent planetary destruction from orbit. Their entire strategy depended on the Xanthari wanting Earth intact and occupied. If the enemy had been willing to settle for genocide, resistance would have been futile. That realization, Sarah explained, was why the assembly was so important. It was not enough to be able to resist occupation. Species also needed protection against existential threats, and that required cooperation. The assembly's mutual defense agreements meant that genocide was no longer a viable strategy. Any species that attempted it would face united opposition from everyone else. The Yalori joined the assembly as the 84th member species, bringing unique perspectives shaped by their aquatic environment and philosophical traditions. Their membership was celebrated across the galaxy as evidence that the new order was still growing, still attracting new participants who saw value in cooperation over isolation. Marcus Chen lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren born into a galaxy that barely remembered the war. To them, the idea of the Zenthari as conquerors seemed as distant as ancient history. They grew up in a world where different species worked together naturally, where galactic citizenship was taken for granted, where peace was the default assumption rather than a fragile exception. He died quietly in his sleep at the age of 97, surrounded by family that included not just humans, but adopted Zenthari and Kalathi, who had become part of the Chen clan through marriage and friendship. His funeral was attended by representatives from 30 systems, including several Zenthari who had fought against him during the war and later became allies in peace. The eulogy was given by Sarah, who spoke about her father's journey from a ship captain who just wanted to protect his family to one of the architects of galactic peace. She talked about how he had never wanted to be a warrior, but had done what was necessary when faced with impossible choices. And she emphasized that his greatest legacy was not the battles he won, but the peace he helped build. Kael'vor, too frail to attend in person, sent a recorded message that was played at the funeral. He spoke about meeting Marcus during the final negotiations, about the mutual respect that had grown between former enemies. He acknowledged that humanity's refusal to surrender had seemed like madness at the time, but had proven to be the sanity that the galaxy needed. Without that stubborn resistance, the old order would have continued indefinitely, grinding species into subordination with mechanical efficiency. In the decades that followed, the story of the Zenthari-human war became a foundational myth for the Galactic Assembly. It was taught in schools across 84 systems, though different species emphasized different aspects. Humans focused on the importance of freedom and resistance to tyranny. Zenthari taught it as a cautionary tale about the limits of military power. Kalathi and others saw it as proof that change was possible, that empires could fall and new orders could rise. The War Memorial on Earth became a pilgrimage site for millions of beings from across the galaxy. They came to see the names carved in black stone, to understand the price that had been paid for the peace they enjoyed. Many left tributes from their own cultures, creating a growing collection of artifacts that symbolized the unity that had been born from conflict. The galaxy was not perfect. Disputes still arose, and the Assembly's authority was sometimes challenged. But the fundamental shift held. Conquest was no longer an accepted practice. Domination was no longer seen as natural or inevitable. And when conflicts occurred, there were mechanisms for resolution that did not require millions.